time is 9:30. This is Radio Singapore. Here is the news. Singapore's Chief Justice designate
On the 4th of January 1959, Radio Singapore was formed.
Sir Alan was Chief Justice of Ceylon for the past 3 years. He will be sworn in.
Its motto, from many cultures, one voice.
Inilah Radio Singapura. Sekarang kita bawa.
Before this, the station was the headquarters for a pan-Malayan organization broadcasting to Singapore and the Federation. When Malaya became independent in 1957, her government decided to set up her own broadcasting station. So in 1959, the two stations became separate entities and Radio Singapore came into being.
Menyambut Minggu Kesetiaan Negara.
Radio was such a popular source of news and entertainment that 70% of the population was tuning in every day.
To me, que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours.
Broadcasts went out for 10 hours daily. Besides music and request programs, there were drama serials, news and current affairs items.
We had some very good programs. Of course, the top of the chart was the request programs run by Kingsley Miranda mainly. He was the king of requests. Most of our programs relied heavily on recorded music. But whenever the opportunity arose, we would go out and do live broadcasts from the hotels, for example, Raffles Hotel, Cathay Restaurant, Adelphi Hotel, Seaview Hotel, and so on. We did magazine programs, magazines for youths, magazines for women's magazines, and every Friday we had a magazine which I produced in which we included interesting personalities passing through Singapore. When they visited our studios, they were fascinated to see a Cantonese newsreader hand the very same script over to a Hokkien newsreader, who would then hand the same script over to the Hakka newsreader. And it was quite possible that although they couldn't communicate between themselves, they would read off the same script.
Also popular then were stories told in the various dialects. For instance, there'll be half an hour of Cantonese stories every day. Lei Dai So had got storytelling down to a fine art. For the Indian community, radio played an important role in promoting its arts and culture. Tamil music, dramas and religious programs were broadcast daily. Radio was the chief means by which Indian musicians and singers were able to gain exposure. Just 6 months after Radio Singapore came into being, the PAP won the elections. The new Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, chose radio as the medium to address the Republic.
At 4 p.m. this afternoon, my ministers and I formally took office. The control of Singapore's internal affairs was formally transferred to the elected representatives of the people.
From then on, hearing the Prime Minister on air became a feature of the station. In 1961 alone, he gave 36 radio talks in 3 languages, explaining government policies. And wherever the members of Parliament went, so did Radio Singapore. Often important speeches were made at groundbreaking ceremonies, openings of factories and schools, and these would be recorded on tape and aired on radio the next day. This kind of work became so frequent that Radio Singapore decided to form a special unit just to record these historic events. One of the founding members was Haji Abdul Rahman Tahir.
The first major assignment was given to us was that to accompany the Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, on his visit to London for Malaysia Talk. We sent our daily report on the progress of the Malaysia Talk, which was broadcast every night here in Singapore. Well, actually in 1963, the Prime Minister toured all the constituencies in Singapore. At that time, it's only 51 of them. And it was started as a fortnightly tour, and then very soon become weekly, and then 3 times a week. And at the end of it, it's daily. That's 5 days a week.
1959, I came here, I said that we must have merger, we must industrialize, or we will collapse. You must always think 3 moves ahead. What happens? Not now. What happens 10 years from now? All these little boys will grow up, you know. They want jobs. They are 8, 9. In 10 years' time, they are past, they want a job. You want them all to be taxi driver like that fellow? We'll become a bankrupt
We record the
nation.
speeches by the leaders and broadcast them on this, for the next morning. That means we got to go back to the office at night, at time up to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to finish the program for the next morning, before we go for another assignment, which is another tour on the following day.
On these tours, the government was getting feedback from the people on their policies, and this was reflected in programs like Question Time, where the public could ask questions of the government and the answers would be heard over the airwaves.
Charging the duties and responsibilities of the government. We would not have survived the stresses and strains.
Radio was also a means of making the population aware of current issues and campaigns.
When you brush your teeth, don't be a water waster. When you take your bath, don't be a water waster.
A year after becoming Radio Singapore, the station took a big step and introduced commercials. For the very first time, advertisers could sponsor shows. Game shows like Double Your Money involved the entire family. Quizzes encouraging audience participation were especially popular. And for the first time, products were advertised on air.
A fish hook, a rusty nail, a knife, a broken bottle can cause disaster to any man, woman or child.
Prevent infection. Use Dettol promptly.
圣诞节就到了，我都不知道买些什么送给我的女朋友。哎，这个容易，人人都说梅花mag手表时间准确，款式弹簧。
All this brought in enough money to improve programs and pay salaries of 500 staff. It was an exciting time, and radio was at an all-time peak when TV came into the picture. At once, this exciting novelty captured an audience from radio. Its listenership dropped off in the evenings when TV was on. But with the advent of the transistor radio, a new audience was catered to. Radio sets were portable and many people could afford them. Radio came into its forte in 1964. When the pro-communist instigated racial riots, the whole of Singapore came to a standstill. To keep the public calm and informed, Radio Singapore was on air for 24 hours for 4 days at a stretch.
It was a skeleton staff. Very few of us were left on the night of the riots. So while a few of us rested, the others kept the studio on the air with music, recorded music, and announcements, keeping the people informed as to where the riots were bad, and that in these areas they had to remain indoors. And we also advised them how they could get food supplies and from which shops they could draw their rice and sugar and essential food commodities from.
Soon, Radio Singapore expanded, increasing airtime, hiring more staff, and introducing innovations like roadshows.
With our arms around each other, and should you be my new romance?
But on the 15th of June 1967, Broadcasting House went up in flames. A short circuit caused a fire that destroyed a collection of 94,000 records. Individuals and embassies rallied round and started another collection. Since then, the records have not stopped spinning.
8:15 on Radio 1 on a Saturday morning with Michael Jackson, something off his brand new Bad album, which is very good, incidentally, The Way You Make Me Feel.
And radio programs still go out live on a service that has not stopped since 1936.
In the 1960s, 110 babies were born every day at Kandang Kerbau, more than any other maternity hospital in the world. Large families were the standard then. Coming from a family with 10 children, Angeline Tan remembers having to walk to school to save money on bus fares. Her father was a fruit seller, earning $200 to $300 a month, and a mother had to scrimp and save to make ends meet. The family squeezed into one bedroom in a Queenstown flat.
There are about 3 families in the flat and about 17 of us. We have no beds, except for my parents' bed. We don't have like what you have today in the children's bed. We don't even have mattresses. We slept on straw mats, and I remember sleeping under the bed. I think every corner there's somebody, even the balcony there's somebody sleeping. And when I grew older, I remember sleeping under the dining table in the hall. We don't have milk powder. Most of us fed on breast milk. And the older ones will have to look after the younger ones. Yeah. And even the clothes you wear is all those pass-me-downs.
Their problems were shared by many others. Even in 1964, more than 500,000 people were living in slums. There was neither running water nor proper sewage. Contagious diseases spread rapidly in these unhealthy conditions. The HDB had started building better homes for the people, but it had still to catch up with a rapidly growing population. It became increasingly difficult to find a job. With 150,000 people jobless every year, there were still masses of people entering the workforce. Singapore was then in the early years of nationhood. With far more people looking for jobs and decent homes than what was available, the consequences would have been disastrous if population growth did not slow down. The answer? Family planning. Though it had begun on a small scale in 1949 with a voluntary service set up by a group of nurses and doctors' wives, their work reached out to only a few. The Singapore Family Planning and Population Board was formed on the 7th of January 1966. Its initial message was, have only as many children as you can afford, but space them out. Nurses and midwives from the maternal and child health services counseled new mothers and pregnant women on family planning, stressing the importance of the mother's health and spending enough time with the child. At Kandang Karba Hospital, mothers were counselled by nurses and doctors, and the Family Planning Board dispensed contraceptives at subsidized rates. It was a good place to work, as 7 out of 10 women in Singapore gave birth here. But there were many social preferences to overcome.
In those days, people had large families. The influence of mothers-in-law was still very great. People thought that having large families, it was a sign of kind of blessing. And then there was, of course, the desire to have as many sons as possible. So we had a great deal of trouble trying to overcome these prejudices. And of course, there was ignorance about the methods of family planning. There were fears. And to overcome these, really, you need to be very patient, and you need to be able to explain simply and clearly, because most of our patients in those early days were not very well educated.
Public campaigns were mounted to reach a wider audience, and the message got through. The total fertility rate, which indicates the average number of children a woman would have, fell from 4.7 in 1965 to 3.1 in 1970. This meant that on average a woman would have about 3 children. Population growth had indeed begun to slow down. Whilst in 1963 only 9.5% of married women practiced contraception, by 1970 the number had increased 6.5 times to 62%. But there was a sudden upswing in births in 1970. One reason was that the post-war baby boomers had now become mothers, and there were others who wanted to have more children. New measures had to be introduced, among them housing incentives for smaller families. Income tax relief was allowed only for the first 3 children. Delivery fees in hospitals were raised. Abortion was liberalized and sterilization encouraged. In 1972, the catchphrase became, "Stop at 2."
A healthy and happy life with a small family.
Out of this emerged the idea of the 2-child family as the norm for Singapore, as more and more accepted the good sense of having only as many children as they could care for properly. By 1975, the fertility rate had fallen to replacement level, which meant that the average number of children had fallen to 2, just enough to replace the parents. In 1975, the board turned its attention to the young.
Teenage is the time for learning and growing. You are young only once. Rushing into marriage, into having your first child, and your second, means rushing into problems. So take your time to say yes. A happy family is worth waiting for.
And women did take the time to say yes. Between 75 and 86, the average marrying age for women rose from 24 to 26, and they had the first child at 27 instead of 24. Family planning had become a way of life. So after 20 years, in 1986, the Family Planning Board closed its doors. Circumstances had changed. Women in Singapore saw a new role for themselves. They were better educated, and their focus was shifting from family life to career advancement. Angeline, who works as a systems analyst, had only 1 child at 29. Though she married 5 years ago, the constraints of education and career kept her and her husband from starting their family until 2 years ago. While smaller families have brought about a better quality of life, they've also created a population problem. Within 20 years, fertility rates have fallen 70% to 1.4 in 1986. This means that parents are not having enough children to replace themselves. If the trend continues, Singapore will face a declining population with less young people supporting the old.
We would be facing labor shortage, we would be facing this shortage in manpower, and at the other end we would be facing an increasing old age dependency ratio. Now, an aging population brought about by declining fertility rates would mean that our society would have to bear an increasing and tremendous burden of social services to be provided for the aged, the most serious of which would be increase in health costs. Then an aging population also meant the productivity of the labor force would decline because, older people obviously could not adapt to changes so easily. So all these combined together would make the economic development of a country slow down quite a bit. The quality of family life would also change, you see. Children growing up in very small families or children growing up as only children would not be able to enjoy the kind of family support, family warmth that could be provided when you have a much larger number of people around the household, when you have a much larger kinship network. And the effect of this would be felt in, say, 10, 15 years' time when the children themselves grow up. Because they would be growing up with fewer siblings, they would be growing up with fewer cousins, and they would have fewer uncles and aunties, you see. And the impact of this on quality of family life as well as on the emotional satisfaction of people as people, again, would be felt more severely when this generation of young people grow old themselves, you see. They would have less relatives around who would be able to help support them, whether materially or emotionally and psychologically.
Singapore's social and economic conditions today call for a different perspective. To achieve optimal growth, population planning is a must. A population planning unit was formed last year under the Ministry of Health. Its task is to look at population trends and suggest policy changes to the government. For now, the unit wants to see more children for those with greater affordability. Its message, have 3 and more if you can afford it. While the choice of having more children remains an individual one, it's a choice which will determine the future and survival of our nation. A place for recreation, a place where neighborliness can grow over a cooking lesson, a stimulating game of chess, or even a vigorous workout. A place to make friends. The community centre has come a long way since the Prime Minister first opened the Minto Road Community Centre on the 9th of January 1960. Let this community centre, Mr. Lee said, become a place for relaxation for yourselves and your sons and daughters. Let it be a meeting place where you can get to know your neighbours better and where communal barriers are broken down. This marked a change for the 28 community centres already existing in Singapore. First set up in the late 1940s, They began as food centers which provided relief to a starving population. Later, their services were expanded and they provided recreational as well as educational facilities. When the PAP government took office in 1959, community centers took on a new role, bringing the different races together. And in July 1960, under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister, the People's Association was formed. All existing community centers were brought under his charge, and new ones were being opened, often with much fanfare. And for the community center leaders, it meant persuasion on their part to draw the crowds to the centers.
Saya melawat ke rumah-rumah, memberitahu bahawa Balai Rakyat Minturut akan mengadakan kelas-kelas bergerakan seperti potong baju, sulam, dan pada tiap-tiap hari Sabtu kita ada tayangan wayang gambar untuk seluruh penduduk di sini.
Coaching lessons by badminton master Wong Peng Soon proved to be a crowd puller. So were other recreational activities such as basketball. And for the ladies, cooking and embroidery classes were favorites. Soon, community centers became a bustle of activity. They were places where neighbors could mix and interact with ease. In 1961, however, a strike by pro-communist elements disrupted community center activities. The strikers put up anti-government banners and closed down various centers. New people had to be brought in to replace them. Only then did community centers return to their normal state of affairs. In the early years, the training of community center leaders was considered important. They underwent physical training so that they would be fit to carry out their duties. They were also briefed by government ministers on the priorities and needs of the nation and taught how best to relate to the communities they were serving.
Our leadership training courses was conducted by the Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Mr. S. Rajaratnam, and other ministers. They explained to us the government thinking, their policies and directions.
Community centers had one strong advantage: closeness to the grassroots. This was important at a time when the government wanted to reach the masses, to explain to them policies such as merger with Malaysia. They were a bridge between the government and the people.
Bagaimana sekarang? Dulu juga kita maklum balas ya. Kita mendapatkan cadangan ataupun dengar sana sini, desas-desus sini, kata orang ramai tak gini, kenapa perintah tidak begini. Semua ni ya kita laporkan kepada Persatuan Rakyat. Itu adalah menjadi tugas Persatuan Rakyat untuk memberikan maklum informasi kepada pemerintah. Jadi dengan cara itu saya ingat pemerintah boleh menyesuaikan apa yang kehendak rakyat dan apa yang harus dibuat.
Soon, many more community centers were built, mushrooming all over Singapore, reaching out to the outermost rural villages. They were service-oriented, providing inoculation for farm animals such as chickens. They also housed the mobile van of the National Library, where books and other reading materials were made accessible to rural folks. Visiting teams of doctors at the community centers brought medical advice nearer the homes of the villagers. And for the young, kindergarten classes were conducted, where they learned how to read and write under teachers who also took time to visit them at home. Today, in the older rural community centers, there isn't much activity anymore. This stands in sharp contrast with the modern community center. It's a reflection of changing needs. The population has become more sophisticated and new activities have replaced badminton and table tennis. One thing, however, remains unchanged. Community centers are still thriving. King Ming and his wife have been living in this four-room flat off Bedok Reservoir Road for the past 2 years. For King Ming, the modern surroundings are a big change from his childhood days when his family of 10 squeezed into one room in a pre-war shophouse.
We only got one main tap which share amongst our 4 families. So as you see, daytime, they got to do cooking, they got to do washing, and other thing else. So the only time when the tap is not occupied is only during the night. So many of the family will try to keep some water for the following day's use.
The conditions that King Ming lived in were shared by many in the first half of this century. Slums had been sprouting up on the island in the late 1800s as migrants from India and China stretched the limits of available housing. Most of these migrants did not intend to stay, hoping to make their fortunes and then return home. All they could afford was a bed and a roof over their heads in tiny cubicles, mostly in Chinatown. With 1,000 people per acre in 1925, it was one of the most overcrowded areas in the world. There was no running water, no proper sanitation. Spread of disease was rampant. Makeshift huts were built wherever space was available. In 1927, the Singapore Improvement Trust, or SIT, was set up by the colonial government to look into Singapore's housing problems. The SIT built blocks of walk-up flats 4 to 7 stories high, but only managed 20,000 homes in 3 decades. It had other priorities, improving roads, demolishing slums, drawing up plans for Singapore. By the 1950s, the situation hardly improved. 8 out of 10 families living in the city had only one room to call their home. 250,000 people lived in badly degenerated slums. 350,000 people lived in makeshift squatter huts. When Singapore attained self-government in 1959, housing was one of the new government's main concerns. The SIT was dissolved and the Housing and Development Board was set up on the 1st of February 1960. Its aim, to build homes as quickly as possible. The HDB directed its energies towards a new form of housing.
high-rise living or medium-rise living in the early days was a very radical departure from the existing style of living in Singapore and in many parts of the world. They consider high-rise living in pigeonholes to be very inhuman. And we actually embarked on this high-rise public housing development in a radical way, more than just because the idea is radical, but because we decided to do it for the majority of the people. It is an experiment not seen in any other part of the world except probably Hong Kong. Land shortage was one reason that caused us to resort to this drastically different approach to housing. It's really because we wanted to house everybody on the one hand, and we have to house everybody in a very limited piece of land.
Construction began in 1960. The HDB wasted no time. In the next 5 years, the board built 55,000 flats. So what was its biggest challenge?
When the housing board was formed, we lost a lot of our experienced staff. So the first thing we did was to try and recruit as many professional staff as we could. Anybody with a degree in architecture, engineering, we grabbed degree or diploma. Then, building on such a massive scale, this was the first time any project of such size was undertaken in Singapore. We want to make sure that we have the requisite supplies of bricks, of cement, of granite, of sand, of steel. Then the other thing is we try to standardize the flat so that we can turn it out more or less like an assembly line.
Queenstown was the first satellite town to be completed in 1965. The early flats had 1 or 2 rooms with proper sanitation and running water. They were rented at a nominal cost, 2-room flats for $20 and 3-room flats for $46 a month. For many, it was a great change.
At Kampong, usually was this kind of flats, mosquitoes, and people who had to share the toilets. And it was air-type huts, those kind of zincs and half air-type, but there's a likelihood of fire also. So sometimes one house catches fire, it can spread very easily to the whole Kampong. So if we stay in housing board flats, we didn't have this worry.
Renting out flats was only a start. The intention was to allow every Singaporean to own a home. On the 12th of February 1964, the HDB announced its home ownership scheme. Families with a combined income of less than $1,000 a month were given the opportunity to own flats. Prices were subsidized. 2-room flats were sold for $4,900 and 3-room flats at $6,200. Low-interest loans with repayment periods of up to 15 years were offered. The first balloting took place in August 1964. By the end of the year, 1,500 families had homes they could call their own. In September 1968, it became easier to own a flat when the government allowed CPF savings to be used to buy HDB flats. 13% of salaries went into CPF, and all of it could be used to purchase flats. In 1965, over 1,500 families wanted to buy flats. By 1975, there were 150,000 applicants, a 100-fold increase. Home ownership had become a way of life, and the HDB met the demand for more flats. Between 1960 and 1975, the number of flats built annually by the HDB increased more than 25 times, from 1,600 in 1960 to 28,000 in 1975. By 1978, the backbone of housing shortage was broken, but the next step was to meet the needs for quality housing.
First of all, we have to create new towns which are self-sufficient, all the essential facilities are there. accessible, like MRT, expressway, and so on. And also, we must create enough space for people to build schools, churches, temples, mosques, and even libraries and so on. The second thing, of course, is to keep looking at the design of the flats and also the organization of the blocks itself. We actually introduced the idea of precinct some 10 years ago. So we actually now have a concept of hierarchy of town, neighborhoods. So there's a continuity of physical facilities available for them to use. And we're putting a lot of work in that area. And I think reaping results, because various surveys show that where the precincts are better designed, the awareness of community comes about much faster.
With higher standards of living, there's also a demand for bigger flats. 4-room flats were introduced in 1969, 5 rooms in 73, and maisonettes in 83. A few months ago, Joachim Marie and his family moved from their 3-room flat in Queenstown to this brand new maisonette in Bishan. Here, the children have the luxury of a bedroom each and much more space.
Where do you see the values now?
The MRT is just a few minutes away, and when the neighborhood's fully developed, there will be shops and a market nearby. Today, more than 86% of Singapore's population live in homes built by the HDB. Most are located in satellite towns with all the necessary facilities. From the original concern of providing basic homes for the people, HDB living has come a long way towards improving the quality of life for Singaporeans and fostering closer community ties.
February 1963.
Okay, everybody, please stand by.
Thousands waited outside the Victoria Memorial Hall.
Stand by VTR to roll tape for Conti 1.
They witnessed the start of a new era.
Tonight, Television Singapura begins transmission with a modest pilot service. It is a sort of running-in period for April, when Television Singapura will be formally inaugurated with a daily 4-hour transmission. And tonight might well mark the start of a social and cultural revolution in our lives.
Then the pictures were only in black and white, and transmission lasted just 1.5 hours. But for the people, it was a wonderful spectacle. The decision to bring in television was made only a year before. So as soon as the go-ahead was given, the then Radio Singapore scrambled to set up a TV station on Caldecott Hill. A garage was converted into a TV studio. As it was the first time Singaporeans were engaged in running a TV station, Australian, Japanese and British experts were brought in, and they began training the producers and engineers. Many of them came from Radio Singapore. Entirely new skills had to be learned and new departments set up. For the very first time, we needed film editors. They had to be enticed from cinema production houses like Shaw Brothers and Shell Film Productions. An art department was set up to help provide graphics in the 4 languages. Many of the artists who signed on came from advertising companies. And special makeup skills had to be learnt to help the stars look their best under the bright studio lights. A creative eye was needed to handle the cameras, and for the first time, people had to appear in front of the camera as newsreaders, compares and announcers.
Hello and welcome to our variety show, Rama, freshly compiled for the opening of Television Singapura. Selamat kita bertemu lagi dalam rancangan istimewa Pesta Rama. 今天是我国电视台开幕的日子。Television Singapuraவின் திறப்பு விழாவை முன்னிட்டு Pesta Rama.
Television was such a novelty that TV importers had a field day.
The day the pilot broadcasting started, that evening so many people rushed to buy the TV. With the family, with children, to see the TV and they want to buy the TV. We remember at that time we want to even to close the shop, also not possible. All our stock for the first 200 sets was sold out within 2 weeks. We have to come in by air shipment to satisfy the customer.
Those who could afford sets suddenly had more visitors to their home, and after an early dinner, entire families could be found at the nearest community center watching TV.
呢次係公眾嘅地方喎，唔係你自己嘅揾㗎喎。咩警照飛刷吉照唔對啊！啊，呢樣實在係公正嘅點呢？啲中共擔保公正嘅為啫。
TV had become a new and popular source of entertainment. Since all 4 languages had to be catered for, many programs had to be locally produced, making up 1/3 of program output.
Camera 1, can you please dolly in very slowly to the dead body, please, camera 1. Camera 2, long shot of the 3 people, please, 3-inch.
Television made stars of local singers and actors, and they became household names.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
Chibaba, Chibaba, Angelawa, Kukla Gumba. Chibaba, Chibaba, Chihuahua, Angelawa, Kukla Gumba, Agumba. Chibaba, Chibaba, Chihuahua, we bambinos come to sing. We bambinos come to sing. Baba.
When TV started, by golly, you should see, it's just natural everywhere. They don't just hear you, they also see you, see? So you get to know more and more people and, of course, more and more shows to appear here and there. So we were really very enthusiastic about it, very keen also, and obviously any artist would be very happy to be called upon regularly.
3, 4. For goodness sake, I got the hippie shake. La
And for many of them, popularity on TV led to local recording contracts. But television was introduced with a more serious purpose in mind, as Mr. Rajaratnam, who was then Minister for Culture, recalls.
It came about the time when the pro-communists were mounting their agitation against merger, and just having reports, static pictures could not convey the atmosphere of violence. So we thought at that time the TV, which is a dynamic technique, could convey it, and it did.
On 28 August 1963, notices were served on 7 unions to show cause why their registration should not be withdrawn.
The result of communist-instigated strikes was brought forcefully home to TV viewers. And the heat of electioneering in 1963 could be felt in every living room.
Everybody in Singapore today already knows that within a couple of days, today is Thursday, Friday, Saturday, in another 2 days, the PAP will be gone from the Singapore stage and will be gone forever, never to form the government of Singapore again.
You know, we faced the ultimate when we decided to fight the communists. And that is painful death, you know. If they ever win, they'll pull my fingernails one by one. We've got enough gumption in us. Having decided to take our lives in our own hands and fight for what we believe it is right, I say we'll fight to the end.
When we started TV, it was done, as far as I understood it then, to try and win over the hearts and minds of the people. The government was not only doing things for them, social services like education and medical services, health services, they had to be shown to be doing them.
Seen on the 21st of last month at the former Outram Road prison site, where the housing
Documentaries were made highlighting social and economic changes. And news bulletins would cover the latest happenings of the day.
If an event, local event, such as the opening of a factory, took place in the morning, the cameraman then would rush the film up to the processing lab. We would then get it back in late afternoon for us to be able to edit script in time for the news bulletin. I remember scripting some films while the news reader was reading it and then rushing someone, handing it over to him.
将取代美元成为国际货币制度的基本地位。
Saudara Jack Yuntong telah juga mengumumkan kepada Dewan bahwa television berwarna akan diadakan di Republik ini lewat tahun depan.
Mr. Tiong criticized RTS for putting out what he described as decadent music and
9 p.m.
Over the years, TV technology improved. Overseas news now arrives by satellite, and news of local events are ready in a matter of hours.
Good evening.
The station still keeps viewers up to date with social, political and economic changes in its current affairs programs. Locally produced drama serials enthrall viewers with something for everyone. And TV still gives local stars a chance to perform before a national audience. 25 years ago today, television was a new phenomenon. Since that day, TV has not ceased to inform, educate and entertain her viewers.
year, hundreds of young men like these don army fatigues and are put through the paces of military training. For 2.5 years, they will learn what it's like to be a soldier. It is a demanding task for them, as it had been for the thousands who have served since national service began in 1967. On the 21st of February 1967, 2 years after independence, the Prime Minister told a youthful nation that it had to start thinking of defending itself.
If you who are growing up do not understand that you've got to defend this, then I say, in the end we will lose. Other people will come, smack you down, take it over. And therefore we have decided, after very careful consideration, that every boy and girl will learn what it is to be a citizen, what it is necessary to defend this country.
The National Service Bill was introduced 1 week later in Parliament on the 27th of February 1967. But some felt that Singapore was too small to defend itself and that spending on defense would only be a waste of time and money. The Minister for the Interior and Defence, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, warned that small states without the capability to maintain internal security and to deter external aggression would find themselves in serious trouble. Before national service started, there were only 2 regular infantry battalions, the 1st and 2nd Singapore Infantry Regiments. This, together with a small volunteer corps, the People's Defence Force, made up of civil servants, mostly in their 30s, were all we had. It was clearly inadequate, even for a small country like Singapore. Also, the British forces on whom Singaporeans relied for defence had already made clear their intention to withdraw from the region. That left Singapore with only a very short time to build its own defence force. The government had 2 options, a regular army or a citizens' army.
Many people thought regular army would be a good option because it would provide soldiers who were professional, who were dedicated and who were available all the time. But there were many disadvantages too. We are a small country, we have limited resources, and being a newly independent nation, I think it was felt that national service would be able to provide a uniting element, a national spirit.
The viewpoint was a professional army could pose a political threat, especially at the time, the 60s, where coup d'etats were a common phenomena. And through a citizen army, you therefore defend this sort of Praetorian development.
But in wanting to build a citizens' army, the government had first to allay the apprehensions of the people.
即係我聽到我仔話要挑兵入去咧，變咗我好驚啦。因為唐山咧係挑兵入去咧就唔翻得嚟噶啦，咁我咪變咗驚咯。咁樣我又驚住佢入邊入咗去，又唔知會唔會俾人蝦佢，係咪？而且咧又後驚住佢入去訓練咧，唔知能唔能夠受唔受得。
I was fearful. I did not know what to expect. I do not have brothers or friends to consult. I felt I was unfortunately to be called up. I asked myself, why me?
Turning citizens into soldiers was a totally new experience for Singapore. The political leadership had to explain the need for national service and reassure parents that their sons would be looked after. At sending off dinners in every constituency, recruits were given medals for being the first batch of national servicemen. It was crucial that the people's support was won. Without that, there could be no citizens' army. So against the backdrop of reassurance and initial apprehension, National Service Days began. Not all were sent into the army. Some 4,000 young men of the first batch served instead in the Special Constabulary, the Vigilante Corps, or the People's Defence Force. They were given the responsibility of keeping the streets safe and maintaining law and order. Clearly, national service was geared to the building up of the country's defence capability. For the recruits, life as soldiers meant adopting a new look and adjusting to a completely unfamiliar routine. It was a sharp contrast with the comforts and freedom of life outside the army camps.
It was very tough. Our instructors expected high standards from us. They were very fit. I was born, I was smaller in size than I'm presently now. I could hardly take the training. It was very strenuous, very punishing. I had to push myself to meet the standard.
But it wasn't only the recruits who had a hard time.
There were lots of resentment in them and the lack of military life, because during those days nobody likes to join the army, and we had difficulties in actually to tune them or to get them to adapt to military life.
The servicemen we used to receive at that time were generally from the lower primary schools and from different language streams. So the officers and instructors have to start off in English and use translators to further reinforce the lesson or the briefings. So we took a little longer and more time was needed with the training of the national servicemen then.
Despite the longer time taken, the first signs of change from raw recruits to soldiers were evident. Resistance to national service gradually waned with each succeeding batch. Over the years, people have come to accept it as part of being a citizen. Today, 21 years later, national servicemen, both in the reserves and active units, have filled up the ranks of the Singapore Armed Forces, making it a credible defence force. More important, it has had a profound impact on Singapore.
There is a greater sense of social awareness, a better understanding of the inter-ethnic characteristics, and through national service, I believe that we have achieved a better sense of nationhood.
For the first time in their life, they realize that they have got something to protect. It's not just something amorphous, something out there. It's me and it, the state. And I think this process is significant and it has a lasting, lingering impact.
dismal sight greeted people outside McDonald House. 3 people were killed in that bomb blast. 36 others were injured. Many have not forgotten the incident.
It was a lucky escape for me. Had I not been called back to the office, I would have been seriously injured in the lift, or even outside the lift, because all the glass splinters came down. It was very bad.
I found poor Mutu, who was a lift operator. He was lying underneath a beam which had fallen down from the lift shaft, because the lift came straight the way down. So I tried to get him out, but I couldn't because the wing was too heavy, and I kept calling for people to come and help me, and they're saying, no, no, we'll get electrified. And I said, well, I'm not being electrocuted, so why can't you help? And I couldn't get anybody to help me, and eventually, thank goodness, the fire brigade came along, and they got the poor chap out.
It was full of debris. I could hardly see in front. And when I came out of the building, I saw the sort of a lot of confusion all over the place. And sort of even the windows of the building outside was smashed. The glass windows were smashed, you see.
For Reverend Yoswan Kim, surviving the explosion was a miracle. But scars from that incident are still there.
当我到了这个电梯的门口的时候呢，就发现有一个爆炸弹从我身上把我弹到外面去。有一个医生从楼上下来，他看到我，他就跟我止血。那么救护车把我送到中央医院去，医生发现我的身上是一块大的玻璃插在我的内肝脏，我身上所有的地方都是疤痕，被炸的疤痕。那么我的眼睛右眼也逝去了，被爆炸出来逝去了。
There had been sporadic explosions in other places carried out by saboteurs. It was the Indonesian confrontation against Malaysia. President Sukarno had launched his campaign of Ganyang Malaysia, or Crush Malaysia, in 1963, but the reasons for confrontation have never really been fully understood. President Sukarno was suspicious and contemptuous of the peaceful manner in which Malaya had been granted independence by the British. That experience had differed radically from the violent revolution that gave rise to the modern Indonesia he helped found. The creation of Malaysia, comprising Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak and Sabah, was seen by him as a neo-colonialist plot and a challenge to Indonesia's position of dominance in the region. Confrontation was also a means by which attention could be diverted from problems at home. At the beginning, confrontation took the form of political agitation and economic sanctions against Malaysia. Then, low-key military operations were launched. Indonesian soldiers infiltrated into West Malaysia, Singapore, Sabah and Sarawak to carry out random acts of terrorism. Here at Pasir Panjang and several other quiet stretches of beach, the saboteurs landed under cover of darkness. Their mission, to dampen the people's morale by carrying out acts of sabotage. But not all the saboteurs were successful in the attempts. Many were caught before they could carry out the missions. All over Singapore, a volunteer group, the Vigilante Corps, kept watch at night. Their duty was to look out for suspicious-looking people and parcels.
Whatever we suspect, any parcel or whatnot, we dare not to do anything. We better make sure what type, whether it is round, flat, whatever it is. If it is flat, we ignore it, we know it. The bomb will be flat, at least round, or hand grenade, some side like a tennis ball. We know how they bundle it. But if we really suspect, we have already been instructed to inform the police, don't touch. So we round all these places where it's necessary, especially near the residence area. like a Drummond Road, all that, Wilkinson Road, that we have to go around to make sure that their life is still secured when the VCs are around.
Exhibitions were organized to educate people about confrontation. Singaporeans were warned not to handle any suspicious-looking parcels, and bomb drills were also taught to counter the acts of terrorism. The 1st and 2nd Singapore Infantry Regiments, which were part of the Malaysian Armed Forces, were sent to the jungles of East and West Malaysia to patrol areas which were infiltrated by Indonesian troops. The low-key military incursions and the acts of sabotage did not seriously affect the morale of the people in Singapore. The cut in Indonesia-Singapore trade, however, did cause some inconvenience and hardship. For those who depended on entrepot trade for a living, the economic sanctions meant a drop in earnings and even unemployment. In response, the government sped up the growth of the manufacturing sector to make the economy less dependent on entrepot trade. But still, Singapore had to live with the Indonesian confrontation for another year before it was brought to an end. At the time of Singapore's independence, drastic political changes were taking place in Indonesia. The Communist Party of Indonesia, PKI, made a bid to capture power through a coup. 6 Indonesian generals were murdered, but the coup failed. The retaliation by the army was swift. The ranks of the PKI were virtually wiped out. The unsuccessful coup also led to Sukarno's downfall. A new political leadership under General Suharto began to disengage Indonesia from the policy of confrontation. Attention was turned instead to addressing the serious problems of the Indonesian economy, which was near collapse. Trade between a newly independent Singapore and Indonesia was resumed. A year later, diplomatic ties were restored. And in August 1967, the governments of Southeast Asian countries decided to form ASEAN to enhance regional cooperation. Confrontation had highlighted the fragility of regional relations. It was realized that political turbulence could only be avoided if there is mutual respect and cooperation. And for Singapore, confrontation was also a learning experience.
First fact is that we are alone now. Unlike before, the British looked after our defense. Today, we have to look after ourselves. Well, for a small country, the best defense is deterrence. That means there are limits to our defense capacity, but whoever attacks us will also pay a heavy price. Second is inner strength. There must be cohesiveness, so people will realize that when you attack, you're meeting a united community. The other factor is economic strength. In case of a conflict, the enemy would work on the basis where their economic resources are limited. Just sit tight, wear them out. So preparedness, therefore, political preparedness, economic preparedness, and military preparedness are essential.
For the ordinary worker in Singapore, life in the 1950s was a struggle. Thousands had no jobs, and those who had earned barely enough to feed the many mouths in their families. People were disenchanted with the British, who seemed unable to provide them with a better livelihood. This, together with lingering loyalties to former homelands, were a potent combination the communists took advantage of.
China was emerging then as a strong nation, and the Chinese school students were very patriotic towards China. And the communists played on their patriotic emotions to draw them into their fold.
The 50s also saw winds of change blowing across the British Empire. India, the most prized colony, had already won her independence in 1947, and the anti-colonial movement was gathering force in many other colonies. In Malaya, the murmur of nationalism had grown into a shout. Although resigned to the breakup of the empire, the British were anxious to prevent the communists from making any more gains in Singapore. In 1953, a commission was set up under Sir George Rendell. Its task was to look into how the people of Singapore could play a greater role in governing the country as a first step towards gradual self-rule. The Rendell Commission recommended a 32-seat legislative assembly, of which 25 were to be occupied by locally elected representatives. Although it meant that there would be more locals than British officials in the government, important posts like finance, internal security, defense, information services, and the judiciary were to remain in British hands. Nevertheless, the release of the Rendell Commission report in February 1954 led to a flurry of political activity and the formation of new political parties. One of them, the People's Action Party, was an uneasy alliance of two opposing political camps. There was the non-communist group of English-educated returned students led by young lawyer Lee Kuan Yew. And there was the pro-communist group led by men like Fong Swee Swan and Lim Chin Siong. It was they who enjoyed the support of the Chinese educated students and the trade unions.
We were very much conscious that we were fronting for them, and the communists were very much aware that we, the narrow middle class, were dependent on them for mass support. That's quite true, and we had to work together. There was no alternative. The communists by themselves had shown that with the emergency regulations, they could not win. And therefore, they had to work through an open front, not through subterfuge.
The Singapore Labour Front, led by well-known criminal lawyer David Marshall, was another newly formed party. Both the Labour Front and the PAP wanted to see an immediate end to colonial rule. But members of the Progressive Party, the oldest party in Singapore, thought otherwise.
We were advocating a gradual transfer of power spreading over a period of 8 years. And at the end of that, consider whether we were in a position to ask for a complete transfer.
We were aiming for independence. I think we were aiming in possibly rather a more conservative way than the other parties. We saw it reasonable to make one step at a time into something which was very important and one had to be very responsible about, not to rock the boat, but to take it in step, as I said, step by step.
But it was the call for immediate self-rule that captured the people's attention. And no one did this more flamboyantly than David Marshall.
Every day at lunchtime, I would be under what I call the old apple tree, and I'd hammer away at all. My entire target was the cricket club. And the cricket club would be lined with the members who rushed their meals in order to hear me on the roof. And by the very vigor of the Straits Times, the Malay Tribune called me a monkey up a tree, wanting to pilot an aeroplane, mixing metaphors right, left, and center. And I didn't scream about it a bit. In fact, I was delighted because I could see that by these attacks of the press, they were making me known throughout the island. And they also built up the heat and the steam of that election awakening our people to the possibility of being critical openly, brutally critical of the British, and telling them the truth to their face without fear of going to jail.
Never before had there been such lively debate in Singapore. Issues like language and the lifting of emergency restrictions came to the fore. But the real crux of it all was the fight for self-government. A clash between the progressives and the Labour Front was inevitable.
We considered that it was necessary to advocate an interim period because in our view, Singapore was then not in a position to take over full responsibility of government.
Whether our people were ready or not, I don't understand that word ready. They had a right to live their own lives according to their own genius, and I call that independence.
As the campaigning drew to a close and polling day arrived, many expected the Progressive Party to win. It had, after all, fielded the most candidates, contesting for 18 of the 25 seats. But the Randall Constitution had brought about significant changes in the composition of the electorate. The Chinese educated, who were mainly from the lower income groups, now made up the bulk of the voters. It was a change that was to prove fatal for the Progressive Party. When the votes were counted, the Progressives found that they had managed to secure only 4 seats.
The basic problem was that the Progressive Party had this image of being conservative, pro-British, and slow-moving. Moreover, I think it missed out the point of the change in the electoral system. It still concentrated on the middle class, English-educated electorate, rather than on the more important and significant mass base of the Chinese-educated voters, who were mainly the lower income groups. Whereas the other parties like PAP and Labour Front went for the larger electorate of the Chinese-educated, left-wing inclined voters.
That strategy paid off. The PAP won 3 of the 4 seats they contested for. The Labour Front, much to their own surprise, won 10 seats. But the elation of winning did not last. Marshall soon found the British unwilling to accord him due recognition.
To them, I really was a monkey up a tree, and I remember the governor saying to me, "Don't rock the boat, and if you annoy the civil service, your instructions will be like a glass of water in a desert. It will disappear, leaving no trace behind. You've got to cooperate with the civil service." They were going to be my bosses, not me, their boss. Oh no, oh no.
Marshall's problem with the British was soon overshadowed by a more serious threat. The communists, who had been biding their time, were to unleash a series of strikes and riots that would severely test the new government. But despite the ensuing violence, the 1955 election gave the people of Singapore a foretaste of what it was like to run their own country. And that experience was to spur them on to fight for self-government and an end to 150 years of colonial rule. vital for the survival of man and the environment he lives in. Singapore has most of the facilities which make life easy. At a touch of a switch, our clothes are washed, and with a turn of a tap, we get potable water. What seems like an inexhaustible supply of water is often taken for granted until the tap runs dry. And this did happen on the 23rd of April 1963. For 10 parched months until the 28th of February 1964, Singaporeans experienced the longest period of water rationing. Because of severe drought, water supply was cut off for 12 hours a day at a stretch. In 1963, both Singapore and South Johor recorded the lowest rainfall in 15 years. For Singapore, it meant a reduction of some 33 million gallons of water daily. The dry spell also affected Singapore's main source of water supply, the Tebrau River in Johor. Its supply was reduced from an average of 45 million to about 23 million gallons a day. Apart from the severe drought, there was a problem of increased water consumption.
The biggest problem was the fact that we had insufficient sources of raw water and a lack of adequate impounding capacity in our reservoirs. As a result, with the dry spell and the increased demand for water, we were drawing down our reservoirs so fast that eventually it was run almost dry. I mean, now if you look at the McRitchie Reservoir here, you find it's a beautiful sight. Water right up to the top water level, trees all around, beautiful scenery. But you should see McRitchie in 1963, when we had drawn the water level down to practically nothing. The whole surrounding area would look like a huge scar on the face of the earth. It was a really frightening sight. And that was because we just could not meet the demand from the public. And so we had to cut that down by rationing. And this demand was caused by various factors. Industrialization was one. We were embarking on a big industrialization program. Jurong Industrial Estate was coming up very quickly. Factories were being built, and a lot of factories need a lot of water for production of whatever they were producing. The increasing population in the country was another. Housing Board was building thousands and thousands of flats, and we had to provide direct water supply to each and every unit. So there was obviously a huge increase in demand.
At that time, Singapore had 3 impounding reservoirs, McRitchie, Piers and Seletar. They had a total capacity of 5,900 million gallons. About a month before water rationing was imposed, stocks in the 3 reservoirs fell from 87% to about 50%. The water level continued to slide to about 40% of the total capacity in May, even after water rationing was imposed. Singaporeans had to be reminded to exercise the greatest restraint in the use of water. They were asked to keep the washing of motor cars and the watering of gardens to a minimum. However, the situation did not improve. The months of May, June and July were the hottest and driest months, so water consumption increased. Water rationing was inevitable. To implement it, Singapore was divided into 7 zones. During the first 2 weeks of water rationing, water supply was cut off for 6 hours each day. But when the situation did not improve, water rationing was increased to 12 hours a day. This started in May 1963 and lasted till January the next year. But the implementation was not without its problems.
In order to effect rationing or the cut-off water supply to these various zones, the only way was to shut off the controlling valves of mains, which would prevent water from flowing into those zones where supply was to be cut off. And we made use of our workers who went about shutting off valves all around the peripheral area of the zone. And this took time.
The implementation of water rationing caught many householders unprepared. Many bought all available containers at inflated prices to store water. The only people to benefit from the dry spell appeared to be dealers in plastic pails and tanks, but they too were not spared the inconvenience of water rationing.
The water rationing was, in fact, for very long hours. And each time it does inconvenience us very much because we got to get up either early in the morning to stock up the water or late at night to stock up the water. And the flows from the tap, as you know very well, is only a very small trickle from the tap, and we couldn't get much out of it. And we would not know that the water would be dirty or not as we stock up in this manner. And anyway, we have got no choice. We still got to use it.
Not only did the tap run dry in homes, but the long dry spell also affected the livelihood of thousands of farmers. Their wells and ponds, the chief sources of water supply, were drying up. This resulted in a drop of income for the farmers, but it was the consumers who had to bear the cost of buying vegetables at higher prices. Street hawkers were also affected by the cuts in their water supply. But unlike many of the residents, street hawkers relied heavily on a constant supply of water for cooking and washing. The health authorities were also keeping a stringent watch on hawkers to help maintain cleanliness and to prevent an outbreak of cholera. But for some hawkers, their difficulties were compensated by more business. Not all sectors of the economy were affected by the rationing. The major industries were exempted from the exercise. An inadequate supply of water would have affected production and even jobs. In addition, essential services like hospitals and hotels were also exempted. But the smaller hotels could not be spared.
We have to cater for accommodate so much food. Now, we have to go and buy those big urns and fill it up and keep them for our use through the day, and also for washing up all the dishes. And it is very important, you know, to have enough water to keep the catering standards up. Then we also have in-house laundry, and we had those big steel drums, and we filled them up with water, and we had just wooden fires, and we boil and sterilize the laundry, and we had to wash them and dry them in the hotel premises.
Appeals were also made to the various government departments to cut down on the usage and wastage of water. In the case of the cleansing department, seawater was used in the cleansing and flushing of public drains. In January 1964, the rains came. This raised the water stocks to about 60% of maximum capacity. By the end of the month, the island-wide rationing of 12 hours a day was reduced to 3 days a week. A month later, on the 28th of February, water rationing was lifted when the reservoirs were 100% full once again. Our experience of water rationing led to a search for more water. From 3 reservoirs in 1963, an additional 11 reservoirs were added. Also, the supply from Johor was increased to meet the growing needs of Singapore's population. Since 1963, water consumption has also risen about 4 times to 197 million gallons per day. While water consumption has risen, all available sources of water have been tapped. Singapore can never be totally self-sufficient in water, and the possibility of water shortage and rationing cannot be ruled out.
As a safeguard against the uncertainties of tomorrow, saving water should not be confined to dry weather alone. It must be part of our daily life.
This was a night of terror. What was originally an industrial dispute became the first major test of the newly elected Labour Front government. The strike by workers of the Hockley Amalgamated Bus Company in 1955 had turned into a bloody riot. 18th April 1955. At the Hockley bus depot in Alexandra Road, about 300 bus workers refused to work for 2 hours. One of them, Kwek Sin Liang, recalls why.
因为迄阵当下我人鼓励工也是少啦，无头家咧，常常讲你哪会使有工做落啊，咁免去鼓励工就好啦。迄阵我人所以才去工会啦，参加这工会啦，叫工会讲，咪要求去淡薄价鼓励工啊，迄阵当下佫做的点佫长啊，毋是讲真短，所以头家袂批准咯。 每个种开工会代表几哪个啦，开会啦，就讲采取行动讲去罢工啦。
These were members of the leftist Singapore Bus Workers Union. The company did not approve of them, so it assigned more jobs to non-union workers. The daily rated union members felt they were discriminated against and threatened to strike again if the situation did not improve. 24th April 1955, a week later, the Hockley bus workers were again on strike. At 5:45 a.m., 6 of them, all daily rated and members of the union, were told there was no work for them. In a show of support, all the others decided to stop work. The company sacked 229 of them. The strike continued for more than 24 hours. The company offered to reinstate those who were willing to admit they were in the wrong, but this was rejected by the workers. They demanded instead that all of them be reinstated unconditionally. Picketing outside the depot, the strikers sang and danced to keep their spirits high. And when the company decided to put some buses on the roads, they tried to stop them.
阮人哦是拿外口门的啦，手牵手安尼款动了哦，哎马打来扣啦，阮人扣阮人咱人袂开无。
Then another group, students from the Chinese secondary schools, turned up in large numbers to show their support for the strikers.
The students during that day were very anti-British, and because of the communist influence, I think naturally they have links with the workers' unions. But there are many things the workers might not be able to do. They have their limitations set, like they are educationally backward. So the students, so the communists will of course use the students, as the agents, so-called, to educate the people. So we will mobilize the students to go there to educate the workers in various ways, like teaching them to sing songs, and also folk dancing. And through these activities also, we will sustain their spirit.
27th April 1955. By this time, the strikers were camping outside the depot. At 6 a.m., the police was called in to help clear the way for the buses to run. In the clashes that followed, 15 strikers and several policemen were injured. Members of the Singapore Bus Workers Union working in the other bus companies were infuriated. They stopped work for 4 hours that day to protest against what they called police bullying. They felt that the Labour Front government had treated the Hockley strikers unfairly. Chief Minister David Marshall decided to set up a commission to look into the Hockley dispute. Over the next week, the commission held its inquiry. It made several recommendations on how to resolve the dispute, but still, the disputing parties could not agree with each other. The workers continued to picket outside the depot, and the students brought food and money to them. They danced and sang songs like Unity in Strength. The police moved in to disperse them.
我個街馬打喎，嚟斷水喎，嚟斷水啦！斷水古早咧就河卡會拍阿毛戲什麼喎，要幫佢去石頭喎，你斷嘢石頭啊，噴咗個人啊，噴咗個人會打閒你啦，冇個人就走啊。
無了啊，又咪講到條嘢石頭係背啦，敢若落雨天啊你講，後生人會凍啦，啲老嘅人敢若有40外歲、50歲嘅人啊，啲石頭你背敢若迄手榴迄什麼彈就叫炸彈啊！你講，因飛起來啊！你講，迄石頭一粒一粒你飛起來。
The British said to me, "We want you to request." This is the governor. I want you to request me to order British troops to fire on rioters. I said, "Me? Order British troops to fire on my own people?" You know. I said, look, you've got to be patient with them. The people are like sick children. They're being misled. You've got to be patient. You've got to explain. You've got to make them understand. To have acted otherwise would have meant not only a large number of deaths, but also the total alienation of the people from the process of democratic government, and they are throwing them back into the last resort, which is a communist revolution.
But patience could not stop the communists from further instigating the rioters. With each day, the tension increased. By now, the various parties had become impatient with each other. There seemed to be no solution. 12th May 1955. About 3 weeks later, things finally came to a head and force had to be used. Trouble began soon after Chinese students arrived at the Hockley depot in 20 lorries at 2:15 p.m. Clashes with the police took place, and soon a violent drama unfolded. Students used stones, bottles and bricks against the police. In the midst of confusion and chaos, vehicles were overturned and burned, and many people injured. Police detective Yun Yao-ping suffered critical injuries when rioters set fire to his car and lost his life. The violence did not end until early the next morning. This was the day later known as Black Thursday. 14th May 1955. There was an uneasy calm at the funeral of 16-year-old Chong Lon Chong. He suffered a gunshot wound on the night of the riots and was paraded around town as evidence of police brutality. By the time he was sent to the hospital, it was too late. On the same day, Marshall announced the end of the Hockley bus dispute. The bus workers were reinstated. They had won their case. However, this did not stop workers of other companies from expressing their anger at the government. A series of strikes took place. As for the Chinese school students, they were held partly responsible for the bloodshed. Their schools were closed, and this led to an outbreak of student agitation. This was a difficult time for the Labour Front government. David Marshall, in particular, was criticized by the British for being weak in his handling of the Hockley riots. To them, it showed that Singapore was not yet ready to govern herself, and this greatly hindered our quest for independence. It was only 3 years later we were able to negotiate successfully for self-rule.
May 1970, the official opening of the National Junior College, marking a new concept in pre-university education. The school was the first in Singapore to admit only pre-U students. Students came from all 4 language streams, the first time pre-U students were integrated. 2 years before, on 17th October 1968, Ong Pang Boon, then Minister for Education, told Parliament that the aims of the college were to provide the best possible facilities for learning at pre-U level, to help students adapt to the lecture tutorial system in the university, to teach self-reliance, adaptability and leadership, and to be well-rounded citizens committed to nation building. Education list was He was actively involved not only in the construction of the campus at Bukit Timah, but also in choosing a team of teachers and planning the college curriculum.
He was a very controversial figure. He had very strong views on where the school should go. But at the same time, he was a person who was prepared to listen to his pupils. And I felt that it was his strong sense of commitment to the school, and also the fact that he was prepared to try out a lot of new ideas that created the school.
2,000 students applied for admission to the college, though there were places for only 600. The college was to be a full-day school with lectures and tutorials, just like in the university. The students who were finally admitted were handpicked by the principal and teachers.
Selection was not based mainly on academic results. We interviewed the pupils. We looked out for other qualities, like whether they were well-rounded, interested in activities other than just learning. we looked at the attitude that they have, and so we felt that we picked the best people who would make maximum use of a system which was more flexible, which gave them quite a bit of freedom, responsibility.
Out of 12, 10, remember that. 10 will
Today, one main feature of the junior college system is lectures and tutorials. But when NJC first started using this method to teach pre-university students was still an experiment.
Now, this fructose 1,6...
It was a time of adjustment, even for the teachers, who had to learn how to lecture to the sea of faces before them.
Glucose 1-phosphate.
Although students came from the 4 language streams, lectures in NJC were held in English. It prepared many students for what was to come in the university. One of them was Lo Sin Leng.
Even cellulose.
I came from the Chinese streams secondary school, so the exposure in the college, particularly to the English language environment, has helped me tremendously. Not only to understand the lecturers, but also the interaction with English stream students. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is in terms of getting adapted to the university style of lecture cum tutorial system, which was adopted by the NJC also. So that certainly removed certain pressure when I went to university. The third aspect is in terms of preparing myself for a better or more comfortable relationship with boys, because I came from a pure girls' school. So I remember the first few months was a little bit uncomfortable, but after a while you got used to it.
Your welfare will be taken care of. Now we shall offer incentives such as reduced Central Provident Fund, or known to you as CPF. We shall allow more freedom of the press.
In tutorials, students were encouraged to discuss everything, even to stage mock elections.
Everybody know it.
Okay, what leadership qualities do you possess to run for what you're running now?
That if I have the capability, or if I can motivate and initiate people to build a better Singapore.
Because they were bright, because they were confident, and we do try and encourage them to be confident, to be questioning, to be critical, not to take things as told to you or what you read. They therefore did question us, and they were encouraged to challenge us. And I think that is the best stimulation, motivation for a teacher to work hard, to read up herself, to see that she keeps up with the students.
And because we have a lot of pressure, therefore temperature increases as well.
What makes junior colleges different is the friendly, informal interaction between teachers and students.
Then why are so many of you inspectors, if that is the case?
Even right,
In the early days, this closeness helped to build the college spirit.
We were all new in this experiment, in this new concept, and I think we all shared the same ideals. We all shared the same goals and objectives to make the concept a success, to get the system get working. And with this kind of motivation, we were able to work together as a team. And I think the most striking thing was this close cooperation between the two groups, students and teachers.
Extracurricular activities were an important part of the school program. Students had to take part in sports and games, as well as music and drama, to give them maximum exposure. Music was one category which created tremendous enthusiasm.
Do you mind playing, we start 2 bars before 156 with the quaver linkings, and you have to play your SFP.
Since the early days, students helped to teach one another, all part of the emphasis on leadership.
As written on the board, the outdoor comm evaluation has been finished and the song dedications.
Another college tradition started in 1969 was the Student Council, which organizes most school events. Those aspiring to be on the council have to run for elections and convince their fellow students of their leadership qualities. In turn, the students are expected to be loyal to the leaders they have elected. For the first batch of students in NJC, it is this spirit of resourcefulness that they most remember.
Because there's no precedence to go back on, we were forced really to think about the problem afresh. And I think that really inculcated in us a spirit of can-do, you know? And because we had to do something, because there's a lot of, not so much overt pressure, subtle pressure that the school cannot fail. And no one really wanted to be in an experiment that would fail. We all wanted to try harder, and we all did. You know? And I think it's in the process of trying harder that you draw on a lot of your inner energies. You also pick up a lot of resources that you think you didn't have.
This independence and spirit is what NJC tries to build in all its students. The success of the college has led to the building of 12 other junior colleges in Singapore, and they've become essential to pre-university education. Each is striving in its own way to produce well-rounded students with values to see them through life.